If you're anything like me, GPS has become a fundamental part of your day-to-day life, whether it's using it to navigate to the next job site, find the nearest coffee shop, or just prevent yourself from getting lost. It's become such a critical part of our day-to-day lives. And what happens if that signal gets interrupted or jammed? Can emergency services get where they need to go? Do airplanes start falling out of the sky? What cataclysms will happen to us? So in this video, we're going to cover what jamming is and what actually is behind these jamming incidents that we've been seeing in the news. So as I said, modern society has been completely changed by GPS. And if you've been paying attention to the news at all, you've probably seen a myriad of headlines from drones being brought down to aircraft losing instrument approaches to just regular people losing GPS while they're on the highway. And that's all being caused by one kind of common denominator, and that is GPS jamming. Whether it's accidental or purposeful, there are some malicious actors out there that are jamming GPS, and there are some people accidentally jamming GPS. So we're kind of going to cover what both scenarios are and what causes them, and kind of what we can do to mitigate those in the future, and how it can kind of impact our day-to-day lives as some of us who are surveying, or maybe just some of us who, like me, get lost more often than I would want to admit. To understand when we have accidental or purposeful jamming, we kind of need to understand what is happening when we jam a GPS signal. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, when we have a GPS satellite, it's broadcasting an electromagnetic wave from space to us on Earth. This is obviously an enormous distance that this signal is passing over. It's over 20,000 kilometers for most GPS satellites. Now, when we jam that signal, all that's really happening is we are creating some sort of electronic noise on the same frequency that our signal is coming in on, and it makes it impossible for the receiver to distinguish the satellite signal from the noise. So I'm going to put up on the screen here kind of an electromagnetic graph of what happens when we have a GPS signal, and you can see that the noise is louder than the signal. So think about it like when I have somebody in the room and I'm trying to listen to somebody else talking, and I have a child or maybe one of my coworkers trying to talk next to me, and I can't understand what that person is saying on the other side of the room. It's the same idea when we have GPS jamming. So now that we kind of understand what GPS jamming does, what does it actually look like to you who is trying to use some device that's using GPS? And what would happen is you might lose signal entirely, so you might just lose your position. What might also happen is you start seeing an increasing amount of error. So those of you who are running into all these solar issues like I was this summer, where we had these huge solar flares, kind of an example of accidental jamming that I'll get into, but your position becomes unstable, you're not sure where it is, and it becomes unusable. So now that we know how the jamming works and kind of what we'd expect to see, what are some ways that we can jam GPS either accidentally or on purpose? So as I mentioned, not all GPS jamming is malicious or on purpose. A lot of the time it can actually be accidental and just caused by incidental devices in the area. So an example of that would be maybe somebody's got a radar transmitter at an airport, or we've got a very powerful radio that is putting out a huge amount of electromagnetic noise that can interfere with GPS signals and kind of block it out. A really infamous example, especially if you're someone who follows surveying news closely, is the 5G rollout in the US. So Legato, they went under some different ones like Lightwave, I think, and maybe E2 or something like that, but they had a plan to roll out 5G frequencies and 5G cell towers across the US. And this spectrum, and again, I'm going to put up a picture on screen, was very close to the GPS signal. And there was a worry from people who operated GPS, and not just surveyors like myself, but also the US military and logistics company and a whole manner of other people, that these 5G signals would actually interfere with GPS signals. And what would happen is, because this 5G has to be broadcast at such a higher power output than GPS, that we would actually see some bleeding of this 5G network into the GPS spectrum, causing some accidental jamming or accidental interference, making GPS much harder to use in the US. And in fact, we did kind of see this a bit with 5G. If you remember, when 5G first rolled out, there was a lot of talk about how it was interfering with aircraft on approach, to the point that certain aircraft had to turn off certain instruments as they approached landing at airports. It was a really big deal at the time. This has since been mitigated with some changing of frequency and antennas on these aircraft. But these are all examples of what can happen if we're not really careful about which spectrums we use. And I'm going to talk about a bit later how we can regulate around that. But we also need to know how malicious jamming works, because that's another factor that we have to consider when we're talking about this. It's not always accidental. Sometimes we purposefully want to jam GPS signals. So if you like this kind of content, or you want to see our repeatability tests, our comparison tests, hit that subscribe button down below and sign up to the newsletter in the description to make sure you don't miss any of the kind of new content that we're putting out. There's a couple really good examples. You know, if you're paying attention at all to world politics, you probably know there's a full-scale invasion of a sovereign country over in Ukraine right now. where we're seeing huge deployments of drones that have changed the battlefield. It has changed fundamentally how they're fighting the war over there. We're seeing this weird mix of World War I style trenches and huge deployments of kind of autonomous drones, which sounds kind of horrifying to me, but thankfully I live here. But if you're a warfighter in that region, you want to be able to block these drones from hitting your positions. So there's huge amounts of electronic warfare where we're jamming signals, we're jamming spectrums, and we're trying to stop these GPS-guided munitions from hitting our positions, and the only way to really do that is via jamming. Another really famous incident is kind of from, I want to say 5 or 10 years ago, when the Iranian government hijacked one of the US military's drones over Afghanistan, brought it down in Iranian territory, stole all the hardware, reverse engineered it, and have started producing their own drones, which are coincidentally being used in the war in Ukraine right now. But this was done by a combination of GPS spoofing, jamming, and hijacking signals that are used to control this drone. So it's not always accidental. Sometimes there are good uses. Oftentimes it's not a particularly nice use, and there's very rarely a good reason to be jamming GPS, which is why there's such tight regulations around this, which is, we don't want this to happen. So in order to avoid these jamming, there's a couple of different things that, you can do as a consumer and that the government has done to prevent that. So as a consumer, you can make sure that you're not broadcasting on frequencies you're not supposed to. So there's a reason that you're supposed to have a radio license in a lot of US states and countries, and that's to avoid having something that's broadcasting on a spectrum that blocks somebody else. So all those backyard radios that you hear about, yeah, they're fun. They can actually cause quite a bit of harm if they're not careful and don't know what they're doing, which is why they're illegal without a license. Another thing you can do is you can buy technology that contains anti-jamming engines. So Hemisphere, which, if you've seen on our videos on the Hemisphere S631, they employ the Cygnus part of their engine. That is specifically designed to combat jamming. I know Novotel and Trimble also have their own anti-jamming technology, and all of this is done to basically filter out that noise I mentioned earlier and try to get to the actual GPS signal that we need to use. Now, government agencies also obviously want to have a hand in this, because if you have to fight a war, whether it be domestic or abroad, you want to be able to prevent people from jamming up your GPS signal unless you want to be jamming someone else's. And what we do in that case is there's like the FCC and the CRTC, they tightly control the frequencies that you're allowed to broadcast things on. That's why if you're using GPS equipment and you're using internal radio, you're only really allowed to run on 400 megahertz or very short range 900 megahertz radios. You're not allowed to get into kind of 1,000, 1,200 megahertz ranges where GPS signals are broadcast on. So all of that's done to kind of keep these signals as clean as possible so that when we're using them as surveyors, we can actually get the data we need and the positional information we need from these satellites without having to worry about some Yahoo broadcasting their, ham radio in the backyard and blowing out the signals we need to use. Obviously I'm coming from a surveying background where we want to talk about how this impacts surveyors. So what can you do as a surveyor who needs to rely on this equipment day to day in order to be able to do their job? Well, there's a couple of different things we can look at. Kind of the most fundamentally important one is making sure that you have a receiver that A, has some anti-jamming capability in it. So it'd be something like the Hemisphere S631 with that aforementioned Cygnus engine. And you want to be able to have a receiver that is multi-frequency. So you see, not just L1, L2, but you see L1, L2, L5, L2CA, L5CA, all of the signals that you possibly can to avoid one signal being jammed up and being unusable. Because the more redundancies you have, the better ability you're going to be able to survey. You want to be able to make sure that you have receivers with good anti-noise filtering capabilities, so they're good under trees, near buildings, that kind of thing. And you want to be able to make sure that you have a receiver that can use as many constellations as possible. So GPS, GLONASS, Galileo, Beidou, they don't all broadcast on the same frequencies. They broadcast on a variety of different frequencies. With access to more information, you're going to be able to guarantee yourself the ability to get a shot, whether it be in difficult conditions where those primarily shine, but also if one of those signals is being jammed up.